how do we help young people to navigate the different routes into work? And education should be preparing people for life.
Peter Cheese is a global leader in people management and the future of work with decades of experience. A degree in ergonomics, he is CEO of the CIPD, world's leading HR professional body, and author of books on technology's impact on work. He shows how AI and automation create better jobs, focusing on human skills like critical thinking, empathy, and lifelong learning.
Why are people so scared of the future?
I think it's because there's so much uncertainty. What might happen if my job changes? Am I going to be upskilled or reskilled? Where's the safety net if I find my job is gone? I think it's a big part of it. It's the fear of the unknown. But I can't respond to all of these things. How do we change the system which is clearly headed in a direction where it is not working? Every time some question pops into my head, I don't think about it. I just go straight onto my Gen AI tool or whatever and just ask the question, is it going to diminish our cognitive ability? We tend to naturally focus on the easy things to count. How do we break that cycle? But then when times get hard, a lot of that stuff tends to go out the window. And I think that's an opportunity.
Peter, welcome to It's All About AI podcast. You know, I've wanted to have somebody on the show that can really talk about how work gets done, the future of work, and I couldn't think of anybody better but to have you. We've been trying to do this for a couple of months now. But for those who don't know you, why are you well-versed to talk about the future of work?
Yeah, thanks, Danilo. It's great to be here. I go all the way back to what I learned at university, actually, which was a subject called ergonomics, which is all about, half the subject was understanding people, psychology, physiology, anatomy, and half of it was about understanding how people interact with systems in the broadest sense. I mean, we can think of things like ergonomic chairs, which are designed with the human in mind. So coming from a very human-centered approach, thinking about the world of work, and particularly how technology was going to impact that future. And I'm talking 30, 40 years ago now. From there, I went into consulting, and I spent 30 years at Accenture, and I ended up running their global practice around all the people side of work, which was all big HR transformation, organizational strategy, job design, things like that. So I've always had that fascination of people with technology in process and organization and business. And the last 14 years coming up now, I've been running the global business of what's called the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, which is the professional body for HR and people development. And we are in this extraordinary time of this debate about the future of work, particularly, of course, driven by AI and automation.
Wow. So, yeah, I mean, that in total, that's what, 30 years?
It sounds like a very long time. Yes, it is. It's getting on for 40 years. But I've always loved this sort of space and this idea of the future of work. And I love this quote, which I think comes from Abraham Lincoln, who said, or others have said it, that the best way to predict the future is to help to shape it.
Yeah.
And I think we are profoundly at that point now. And I've always believed that what we need to do is make sure we are shaping work that is good for people. And if it's good for people, we'll create not only better business outcomes, but we'll create better societal outcomes as well.
Great. I think the first place to start in is, why are people so scared of the future? Yeah, it feels like when you talk to anybody about the future, they are a lot more tense about it today than they were 10 years ago. Why do you think that is?
I think it's because there's so much uncertainty. I mean, what's fascinating to me, and I've always sort of thought in this very systemic way, if you will, is you could take models like the PESTEL framework, so you say political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental. And in all my experience over those years, I have never seen, I don't think anybody could say they have seen so much going on in every one of those dimensions. I mean, if I go back 20 years, just taking the political dimension, we were all talking about globalization. We were talking about a world that social democracies would thrive, and people even talking about the end of history, quite literally. Yet what's happened since then is what I've described as the handbrake being pulled on globalization ideas. Now that has accelerated to the point where we seem to be going into reverse. The whole geopolitical agenda now seems to be about protecting our own or grouping with other nations that you would recognize from 30, 40, 50 years ago. So I think that's and that's just one dimension of uncertainty that's going on. As I said, you can look across all these other areas. And uncertainty creates challenge for people. It creates challenge for business. It creates challenge for individuals. And one of the areas I spend a lot of time with and talking to are young people, because of how they view the future of work. And there was a very interesting piece of research done by the OECD last year, which I was part of and presenting it, which asked young people around the world what they felt about the future and the future of work. And the overwhelming thing was uncertain. Very uncertain about what jobs they were going to be able to do, what opportunities they would have. And what was perhaps even more challenging in that survey is the UK came out almost worst on that list in terms of the uncertainty of young people. So as I said, I think it's the context in which we're living and operating that creates that nervousness.
What's funny is it seems that all generations are nervous. It's not just people who are still at work or people who are in middle management or in senior positions. It's young people as well who are usually optimistic about what they want to do in life, right? They want to try new things. I mean, because I'm in this space for a long time, I feel more secure about the future than I've ever felt. But it's not because I'm in the world of AI and I know a lot about it. It's more because I feel like today we have more control over what we can do. Yeah. Because we have this amazing AI sidekick that can build anything for us. You know, all the barriers to entry to starting a company or starting your own consultancy or anything has gone down. Are people looking at it the wrong way? Is the fear factor really down to, ignorance of not understanding what this could do for them?
I think it's a big part of it. It's the fear of the unknown. And the reality is, as you know, that the level of awareness and understanding of AI is very, very mixed. So I think fundamentally that's the issue. And how do we help, therefore, encourage and equip people of all generations to understand better and lean into AI and see its potential benefit? But of course, we also know there's a lot of discussion about this idea of agency. I mean, what you just described there, Danilo, is you have a great sense of agency, that you can control what's happening, you can see the opportunities. But if I'm sat in a large organization and could be anything, I mean, like a driver, and that's what I've done for the last 30 years or so. And I've never necessarily aspired to do more than that. That's kept me occupied and given me a living wage and so on. But then looking at the future and saying, but a lot of those jobs could just disappear. And what does that mean to me? Where's my agency in that? Who is going to look after me if my job gets significantly changed or displaced? And it's those sorts of fears that I think we see very, very widespread. And your point about all generations is absolutely true. You'd be familiar with FOMO, so fear of missing out. I came up with this thing, FOBO, which applies to two generations. So for the younger generation, FOBO is fear of being offline. It's particularly true of Gen Z.
That must be the biggest fear.
Particularly true of Gen Z and Gen Z. And FOBO for the older generations is fear of becoming obsolete. And I think both those things are true. So you got the younger generation saying, gosh, what's going on? How do I engage with this? What does it mean for jobs and future of work and jobs for them? And for the generations at work, they are increasingly concerned as to, so what's going to happen to me? What might happen if my job changes? Am I going to be upskilled or reskilled? Where's the safety net if I find my job is gone? All in times, as I said, of a lot of other factors that are driving uncertainty: geopolitical change, economic uncertainty and cost of living, social change. They're all coming together, and that's, I think, what creates that environment.
Are there any, the usual jobs, like you mentioned, drivers, dishwashers and things like that, they will disappear. But are there any other jobs that people would be surprised are going to probably disappear quite soon?
Yeah, I think there are lots. I mean, one of the interesting ones is programming. You don't have to go very far back, 5-10 years, when everybody's saying, oh gosh, I can't get enough programmers and people can write all this stuff. But we know with vibe coding and everything else, AI is very, very adept at doing things like that. But also, if you look across the sort of job spectrum, I think there's a lot of talk now about not just those more sort of manual type activities that could be replaced with AI and robotics, but it is a lot about sort of knowledge work. So if I take as an example, in my own background around professional services, there's a lot of jobs there that people are saying, well, they can be significantly enhanced or done with AI, and particularly as we move into this sort of era of agentic AI, that a lot of the tasks and activities that you would imagine, particularly, for example, what I would refer to as entry-level jobs, so those sort of basic analyst-type jobs that we used to do, will those get automated out of existence? And what we are seeing already is a shift from, particularly in those kind of organizations, from what you might have described as a pyramid-shaped organization to a diamond-shaped organization. Because what I still need in knowledge economy and knowledge-type business is I need good experience that can provide judgment. And that just links to a point that a lot of people talk about, the human in the loop with AI. I think it's that, but it's more than that. It's the human judgment in the loop. But the question is going back to the diamond analogy, is so how do I get to that level of experience where I can apply the judgment if I never started at the bottom and learned the basic tasks that might have trained me as a lawyer or as an accountant or as a management consultant? Those kinds of jobs, which I think are certainly causing a lot of concern, if you will, at the end of a spectrum, which is impacting, say, graduates. So a lot of the graduate-type jobs, it's not just the low-skilled jobs and manual jobs, it's these other jobs which I think are causing as much concern as any.
So we're really talking here about a structural problem, right? So if it's taking a lot of the junior jobs, how do they ever become a middle management and then leadership one day? And how do they even get the experience of just basic meeting etiquette and how to behave themselves in the workplace? How are we going to solve for that?
Well, that's sort of what you just described there as typically called employability skills. So as you said, how do I turn up sharp at work, and what are the basic etiquettes, what are the basic disciplines? Now, the interesting thing is since arguably when Gen Z or Gen Z first started to appear into the workplace, just pre-COVID and then the COVID generation, there's been a lot of surveys, including the ones that we've done as the CIPD, that when you ask employers about what do they think about this generation, their preparedness for work, you find that a lot of employers saying they don't seem to have some of those basic etiquettes, those basic disciplines, recognizing actually you have got to turn up on time and things like that, and how you work in teams and collaborate and communicate. And there's some interesting dynamics going on there. I mean, part of it's this argument about a generational difference, and maybe a generation that some would argue feels more entitled and also perhaps hasn't had that opportunity that previous generations might have had. I mean, my first jobs, like so many of us, were manual jobs. I was doing paper deliveries. I worked as a hospital porter. I was serving behind bars. I was fruit picking and stuff like that. And they taught me an awful lot about the very basic things of how you turn up at work.
Sure.
So some of that was already present, and then you sort of layer in these other questions about, so what is it that I would expect young people to do? If AI is beginning to take some of those entry-level jobs, then what do I expect them to do? And the challenge we have right now, I think, is that if you combine this concern of organizations saying, well, I want to hire people that have got basic employability skills, or I need to hire people with enough experience so they can apply judgment to the work that the AI tools and systems are doing. And added to that is the cost of recruitment and hiring people. So, I've been very involved with the government in the UK on what's called the Employment Rights Act, and then increases in things like minimum wage. All of those factors, when you add them together, including this idea that AI is going to take some of the entry-level jobs, is putting an awful lot of pressure about the future of employment for young people in particular. And those are the reasons why, as I said before, why young people are nervous, because they're seeing all these things going on and saying, so where's my opportunity to get on the ladder?
Yeah. I mean, it's a bit of a joke, or even, I dare say the word meme, but, when you apply to entry-level positions, the job descriptions are just getting, the joke is that, entry-level job, you got to have a minimum 10 years experience, at the bottom.
Yeah.
It is complicated. I think the only way to really save, entry-level jobs is if young people end up learning so much about AI that the organizations need them in order to reinvigorate themselves as a company. I don't see it happening any other way, because unless someone who doesn't have a lot of work experience learns a lot about AI, there's not much else they can bring to the table. And also, a lot of the entry-level jobs can be done by AI as well.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that?
I think there's truth in that, and that then leads us into probably a bit of a discussion about things like education and how much education has to change and adapt to the modern world, and what are the skills that we need to teach, not just young people, but actually everybody. Part of it, you're right, I think will be about AI and how I use it effectively and responsibly. We've long debated this point about digital skills and government saying, we need to train everyone in digital skills. And then you say, so what do you mean by that? And I remember years ago, one of the education secretaries saying, well, what we need to do is teach kids at school how to code. And I said, I don't think that's really what we're talking about here. It is about how you use these things responsibly, how you transact safely, how you understand, and this is a particularly important point now with AI and generative AI, that what these tools may tell you may not always be true.
Sure. Yeah.
So that is usually described in terms of essential or critical thinking. So we've done a lot of work with others on defining what would be these foundational skills that everybody needs. So in the past, we talked about things like literacy and numeracy, and to be honest, we still have some challenges with some of those things.
Yeah.
So that you could add now digital skills, which is some of the things I just described. But beyond that, you're then into this sort of layer of what is often described as essential or transferable skills. And those are really interesting because they are the truly human skills. They are the skills of things like critical thinking and empathy. They are the skills of things like communication and the ability to learn. And organizations over recent years have been increasingly focusing on those things, because if I have those skills, then I can build on top of that the job skills that I need. And we know that the job skills are changing faster and faster. A lot of people talk about a half-life of job skills now as being 3 years or less because of the advances in technology and how it's going to shape the jobs of the future. But if I've got those essential skills and I understand those things, then, as I said, as an organization, what I've got to do is make sure I can develop the job skills really quickly.
Sure.
And that talks a lot about how we upskill and reskill. So, as I said, going back to the point about education, then is education teaching those things? And I've taught a lot at schools, including primary schools, secondary schools, colleges and universities. I always talk about these ideas and say, to what extent do you think you're being told that those are the skills that you need to learn? And the answer is not really. Because we have an educational system is very hard to change. We've got things like the national curriculum, and it's about exams and passing exams. It's about retention of knowledge. It's about didactic approaches to learning, as opposed to what we're going to have more and more is Socratic approaches to learning. So rather than me just telling you, this is what you've got to know, this you've got to learn, and that's what you've got to repeat in a somewhat artificial environment in an exam, what I need to teach you is how to think critically and how to debate things.
Sure.
And one of the other challenges that I'm sure we'll come on to, Danilo, is and what is AI's role? What is the people designing these technologies? What is their responsibility to help to create that kind of environment? And the other point I would make about young people and the use of AI is that what employers are seeing now is a very difficult recruitment environment. I mentioned recruitment is being a bit squeezed anyway, but almost any job, as I talk to many different employers, I put out a job posting, and within minutes I could get hundreds of applications. Because what young people are doing, you can't blame them for this, is they're using AI to polish up their CVs, make sure it fits the job description, writing a really top-class personal statement and all of that. So employers are reading this stuff and say, well, I can't literally distinguish one employee from, or prospective employee from another. So then the employer starts to put AI to filter it on their side, and then we get all sorts of questions about bias and other things like that. So there's something else going on here, which is how do we help young people to navigate the different routes into work and not just assume that by having a highly AI-polished CV with an agent, and they're doing this more and more, that searches all the online job sites, and every time something comes up that looks remotely relevant, bing, in goes the job application. That is not how you're going to get a job.
It's even more shocking than that. There are companies like Loop CV, and it automatically applies to jobs for you. You're not even applying to jobs yourself.
Absolutely. It's a sort of agentic approach to it.
You set up the criteria, and it just does it all for you. It fills in all the forms, it fills in all the applications, everything.
Which sounds all very clever, but does that help you get a job? And as I said, it's already beginning to overwhelm employers in terms of, but I can't respond to all of these things. And then you've got to it disheartens young people even more because and I hear this all the time, I've submitted 500 job applications and got nothing.
Yeah.
Well, start with that question. How do you think 500 job applications are going to distinguish you from anybody else?
Yeah.
What is it that's going to make you stand out? And it will come back to some of the things we've already talked about, that you can demonstrate some of these so-called employability skills and essential skills and things of that nature, not just that you've got some fabulous qualifications that have been enhanced through AI.
Yeah. And the other problem, Peter, as well, is there are even applications that when you go to an interview, if it's virtual,
Yeah.
it actually sits on the Teams call. Nobody notices it. And it even gives you the transcription of what to reply when you ask questions.
Yes.
Even for technical interviews, for coding interviews. So I think the whole, I'm not skipping over education. We're going to go back there. Yeah. It's just that my blood boils when I hear recruitment because for many years now, the recruitment industry has been completely broken. It's essentially what you're saying, and it's very true, is it's agents applying to jobs that are being reviewed by agents.
Yes.
So it's agents applying to agents. I mean, it doesn't make any sense anymore.
Yeah.
But how do you fix that? That's a hard one. I know I put you on the spot on that one. But
no,
how do you fix a problem like that?
Yeah, I think it comes back again to sort of education and helping young people working together with employers to say, right, how have we got to change this system? Because you're right, those are the other aspects that are frustrating people. And you'll hear it. And I hear recruiting managers saying, I can see their eyes move. Right, so it's a Zoom call, and I can see their eyes move because they have taken the question, put it, or the AI system's listening, so it plays back the script. Yeah. So we're not in a good place with a lot of this stuff, and recruitment really is about this ability to match the opportunities of the individual. A lot of debate over the years about making sure that recruitment is fair and it's inclusive.
Sure.
People worry about bias, and of course, they particularly worry about bias in AI, and I always say, like humans aren't biased. I mean, bias in AI comes from us, but so we've got to really understand how we can use AI in a positive way to act alongside the human, which is when I talk about the human judgment in the loop, where we understand bias and iron it out of the system. But also, as I said, working between the employer and the prospective employee and the educational system and careers advice and things like that to say, how do we change the system, which is clearly headed in a direction where it is not working?
I mean, one thing I think that might work is if employment worked a little bit more like scouting for sports teams, where, scouts go out and they try to identify people early on by building relationships with universities and schools. And maybe that's how we even, keep universities more relevant as well. Mm-hmm. And then, employers getting to know people at a younger age, going to watch them, give a little speech on campus and, reading their dissertations and helping them with their coursework and, career fairs and things like that. That's probably the only solution that I see to that problem. Because then that person for a while, and you know that when they go to the interview, you know what their skills are already. And, I think universities have such a role to play in that side of things.
They do, and colleges and even schools can do that. Yeah, I think in order for a system to work like that, what we're describing is a closer integration between the world of education and the world of work, fundamentally. Yeah. And it has other aspects to it as well, because we know that one of the things we have to be able to do is upskill and reskill people more and more rapidly, as I said. We know that we've got to create, therefore, cultures of lifelong learning. And the educational system has to play its part in that. Now, when you look at things like lifelong learning as a cultural dynamic, it is not a strong culture within the UK. It really isn't. The educational system, but also the attitude towards education is so often, well, I've done my school education at 18 or 21 and that's it, great, I've finished. Yeah. That is not how it should be. The standout examples of that are typically the Nordic countries, where they see lifelong learning as absolutely part of the system, and young people are taught that from a very early age. So this bringing together of education and employment is critical. Sure. And if I take the lifelong learning as an idea, then it says, okay, so I've now got to work between, say, the local colleges and the employer to say, as an employer, I can't necessarily do all the training I need. I need to work with the educational system, say the local colleges or whatever it might be, to help upskilling and reskilling. But your idea then, it says that if we can get closer integration between employment and education, then that starts to expose that opportunity of more visibility, as you're saying, of young people to employment, and from the employers young people, but you're doing it in a very constructive way because it's seen
Yeah.
as a joint enterprise between the world of work and the world of education to create the workforces of the future.
Yeah, and I think it's essential as well. It's almost like the school or the university is an extension of the recruitment team of the company. You know, they need to work really well together.
Yeah.
Some universities do that pretty well.
They do, and I'm
Yeah.
also quite a fan of FE colleges, which have been very underinvested in this country. They support a lot of vocational training. They work very much with local organizations. The good ones work very closely with local employers. Universities can be part of that system, absolutely right. But we need to look at all aspects of the educational environment and say, all right, what are the right channels? What's the right engagement? We need to have better careers advice and guidance because this is, navigating a future world of work, and people talk about squiggly careers and all these sorts of ideas. But that that bringing together of these two big systems, if you will, of education and employment is not historically how it's worked. And education has very particular views as to what it needs to be educating young people about. And part of it is to teach them how to learn, definitely. But surely part of it must also be to help them understand how to navigate the world of work and prepare them for that in terms of these essential skills I've described.
So there are some schools attempting to correct how education is done. I mean, this is no surprise really. Some people already know this, but my son was going to go to a school in Dubai until the whole war kicked off, and it's called GEMS SRI. It's a research science and research institute, and basically there are robots everywhere.
Yeah.
There are gaming stations for them to play esports. There's a place for them to learn how to speak in front of camera.
Wow.
There are stages to help them prepare for their first TED Talk. They learn finance. They play on the stock market. There are simulation stock markets. It's quite different to traditional school. It kind of teaches everything they need to go and set up their own company one day, or be a news anchor, or all these kind of skills that we need for the future. And we have some others. There is synthesis. There's Ad Strata, these schools that came out of Elon Musk's SpaceX program. But all of these schools are private schools for the elite.
Yeah.
And I think you're definitely right. I think the public education system is in real trouble. And I've also spent a lot of time going to schools, talking to different education institutions, and it's just very hard to. I'm even getting cases of teachers banning their kids, their students, from using AI
That's right.
instead of actually embracing them and teaching and coaching them how to use it. And obviously, all the kids are using it
Yes, of course.
to write their essays.
Of course they are. Yeah.
And they're clever enough to say, write like I'm a 10-year-old,
Yeah.
make some
That's right.
mistakes.
That's right.
So there's definitely a conversation to be had. It feels a little bit like, if you're becoming of legal age and you want to talk to your parents about sex for the first time, very awkward.
Yeah.
Everybody avoids it until the very last moment,
Yeah.
unless you have the right parenting skills and you preempt it at the right time. So it's, I don't know how to correct that one.
Yeah, that's an interesting one because I've experienced exactly the same thing. You go talk to the students and you say, guys, do you use AI? And they say, oh, no, sir. And I said, let me ask the question again. Do you use AI? And they say, well, yeah, we do, but we've been told by our teachers we can't. So the reality is that it also is a fear of the unknown. Going back to the point we made earlier, the level of understanding of AI and to a significant degree, therefore, the level of fear about it is very high. And we need this to be in the educational system. We need teachers to understand these things and what it is that I've got to teach young people about these sorts of tools. So that there's a lot to be worked through on that. But I think it is these in the end become. These school examples you're talking about now, I think are fantastic because excuse me. In the end, what we're talking about is helping to equip people for the not just the world of work, but life. These are life skills.
Yeah.
And education should be preparing people for life. But how we make a shift in this much broader education system will take time. And it takes some real forward thinking. We've got to look at it from a policy perspective, from a governmental perspective. We've got to think about it, what we've got to educate teachers and how we train them differently to think about these things. Yeah. And as I said, moving to a world which is much more about, I have these incredibly powerful tools in my hand that I can access anything on any subject at any point in time What I've got to be able to do is think critically. And what is, I think also, therefore, causing greater and greater concern is what's the role of technology in supporting this? I touched on this earlier. And we're beginning to see this challenge happening now more and more. So the recent case with, who was it, Meta and Alphabet, Google, about this parents of a young girl taking them to court saying, you are writing algorithms which is creating this addiction to technology and your tools, and it is affecting their mental health. Now, we've known that for a long time. I mean, truth is that these tech companies, that's precisely what they do. You know, if you look at this as a product and I'm trying to get as many people attached to it, then I will create algorithms that draw you in, that keep telling you that everything you're asking is great, that keep giving you the same sort of stuff that you've always believed in, and create these echo chambers. Now, those echo chambers are creating societal problems because we seem to be in a world where it's harder and harder to have a sort of balanced dialogue, people taking far more entrenched views, and it is definitely affecting, therefore, sort of societal trends and issues of that kind. Gen AI, much the same sort of thing. And I love these sorts of ideas or ways of framing it so that people talk about sycophancy. So you go onto a generative AI tool, you type in your question, what does it first come back with? It's a great question, Peter. I think it's really interesting. And here's all the things you should think about. It doesn't come back and say, so why are you asking that? What are your thoughts on it? And I can give you this example of things that might be interesting to you, but how about some examples over there that might be slightly different to what you just heard? And I was talking to somebody the other day who was is doing work in Estonia. Now, Estonia is a really interesting country.
It is, yeah.
Not a big country, but it's one of those countries which had one of the fastest rollouts of internet usage and training their population on digital skills of any country in the world. So the educational system in Estonia has been challenging the OpenAI and companies like that to say, I want you to change the way your algorithms work to encourage this idea of critical thinking. So I think what we're beginning to reach a point is, so we've talked a lot about what we're going to do in education and training young people, but we have got to address the other side of this problem, which is how do you get these tech companies to think differently other than just saying, I've created all these algorithms which just keep drawing me in. And that's a difficult one too, because of course you can imagine, I mean, OpenAI, whoever it is, would say, yeah, but that's not going to help my business model. But I think we have to find a way to get there. And I honestly do think when we think about regulation's got to move into this much broader space. I think that we're going to start to see regulation on these sorts of things because I can't really see how else it's going to happen. It's very hard to imagine how some of these companies will do this voluntarily. And you'll have some views on that.
Yeah. I think what I'm seeing at the moment is countries banning social media.
Yeah,
like Australia, up until the age of 16 or something like that. Or
I think
13.
it's a very crude approach, and I don't think it's sustainable.
It's a lazy approach.
Yeah.
It's a lazy approach. I mean, a country as big as that could easily approach the tech companies and say, look, there's no entry here unless you change your approach.
Yeah.
And then, sign a petition with a few other countries. And
I think they're going to take a different route at it. But it's the classic way. I mean, we talked about it in the schools. What's the first response to this big thing I don't really understand and I think it might be harming my people? Just stop.
Yeah.
And you can't. I mean, young people, everybody's smart enough to find the ways around these sorts of things. So it's never going to be perfect. But what it is it's like King Canute trying to stop the waves coming in. What we've got to do is figure out how do we work with the waves coming in to make sure that as they hit the shore, as it were, that they are doing it in a positive way.
Yeah. So we've spoken a lot about the jobs which are going to go and education.
Yeah.
This is one that I sometimes struggle with, and sometimes I find a lot of examples. But what jobs are going to get created? Because I'm still of the opinion that if a company has the right attitude, they're using AI to create new products and services to go and compete in new markets they never competed in before, then surely that will create more opportunity, and surely that will create more employment, as well as this technology creating new jobs that we don't have today.
Yeah.
Do you have any in mind which are your favorite new jobs that will exist in the future?
Well, what was it? I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, people started to get very excited about things like prompt engineering. I noticed that's got a bit quieter, but this sort of idea that, let's go back to the judgment in the loop. So you can imagine sort of tasks that we would have said, okay, I'm going to spend lots of time on spreadsheets trying to figure out patterns and so forth. Now the job starts to shift to one of saying, how do I interpret the patterns and what does it mean and what actions do I take as a result? So you can see a lot of jobs sort of changing in those very fundamental ways. It's very hard to predict, is the honest truth, Danilo. I mean, there are many people talking about all sorts of different types of capability. I think, paradoxically, you could look at some very traditional jobs that we might see a lot more of.
Sure.
I mean, people talking a lot more about trade skills. I work a lot with delivery companies is one of the other things I do. And those represented ancient trades, many of which had long disappeared. Mm-hmm. But they are now talking about heritage skills. Well, why wouldn't we have more people that can be goldsmiths or whatever? These craft skills that not only are highly prized in many ways, but also people looking at jobs and saying, well, that's going to be pretty hard to automate, isn't it? Mm-hmm. I mean, other favourite examples are things like being an electrician or a plumber or a carpenter or something like that. I think we're a long way off, which is not to say it never happen, from seeing robots coming in and fixing my electrical system in my house. Yeah. So you've got that side of the equation, which I find really interesting. And certainly when I talk to young people, I say, do not dismiss the idea of going into what we would have regarded as trade skills, because if you can do that, you're probably going to see that job carry on to the future. They are also very good jobs to build a business around. You start as a sole trader or whatever. Yep. So you got that end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum, which is more on, say, the knowledge economy and many of the jobs we've already talked about, quite hard to predict exactly what the jobs will be, which is why I go back to this thought that but we have agents in creating those jobs. And one of the things I'm very passionate about is the role of the people profession, the HR profession, in working very closely with the technology function to say, all right, how do we design the jobs that are good for people, not just because the technology can do this. And to be honest, if you look back over the history of technology and say robotics, you can see a lot of workplaces today that you would have said in the past, that is not the kind of job people should be doing. It's sort of highly scientific management. It's all structured around what the technology can do. And the person in the middle is just doing the stuff that technology found really difficult. You can look at logistics warehouses that operate in ways like that. And then you say, so the job that is left for the human is not really a very good job for the human. Sure. It's not using all of our skills. It's not allowing them to grow and to develop. So that is why I talk about this idea of agency, and that's why I talk about this idea of the best way to predict the future is to shape it. We need to work together to shape the jobs that get the best out of people and get the best out of technology. And I think in the long term that helps societal outcomes, well-being, and a whole bunch of other things. But I think also we must surely be in a space where we can reduce the levels of stress. One of the other things that's so sad about work today is just the levels of stress or the levels of unfairness and things like that. I think we've been working on these forever. And now we've got a big inflection point. We have an opportunity to change some of those things. But it is only going to come through positive action, designing jobs based on the good work principles and things of that nature. And I think that's an exciting opportunity. And then finally, and I saw Sam Altman commented on this the other day, I do profoundly believe that we could end up in a world of work that we're only working on average 4 days a week. I've said this for years. There is no law of physics or law of nature that says we have to be working 5 days a week or working like we work. There's no law of nature like that. So why not create a future of work that is better for our well-being, we have better work-life integration, and all the other things which we actually care about?
Yeah, I fully agree. We are going to get into the HR profession soon. There's a lot to unpack as well. You mentioned, how to manage anxiety and things like that. So we are going to get to that as well. One thing to go back on really quickly is it's an idea for people, because people are always asking me, Danilo, what can I do with AI and what's the future and all this kind of stuff. And you mentioned the trade, so plumbers, electricians. One thing that I really love is brownfield projects or anti-technology plays. So let's say that I did this actually about 1.5 years ago. A good friend of mine, he had a solar energy company. And I saw the way that they were booking the jobs, to go and install solar energy panels in houses and businesses. And I said to him, Sam and Ben, who were running the company, I said, guys, you're doing this through WhatsApp. It makes no sense. Yeah. Why don't we go and build an AI platform, that emails people, that does all the invoicing for us, that outreaches, to find new clients for us, and does market analysis and studies. And when we do quotations, getting AI to measure the roof for us, and all the different combinations of the systems, and today is one of the fastest growing solar energy companies in the whole of UK. And I think if we can get young people who understand AI better with the tradespeople, or get people who are young to start trades like plumbing, electricians, etc., that can be very exciting.
It can.
And that can be an area where the UK really excels in.
Yeah.
And it's a great way to go after the jobs who are still protected, but then put a layer on top of them with technology, where we still teach people AI skills as well. That's an idea for anybody who wants to start a new company, or want to have a business idea. That's one of the best things.
And I agree to that. I think one of the things we have to be careful of in scenarios like that is control, right?
Yep.
So all the decades of behavioral science research show that, and a guy called Dan Pink summarized this very well in a book called Drive, is that there are three things that most matter in terms of driving people's engagement. One is purpose, so to believe in what I'm doing, does it make any sense? And that's become particularly true for younger generations. Mastery, which is that I want to improve, and part of your job as my manager or as an organization is giving me the resources, learning and other things so that I can improve and master what I do. But the third, which relates to the point I wanted to make, is one of autonomy. When I said that a lot of technology implementation in the past has rather created these jobs where I actually don't have control, I have very little autonomy. If I'm working in a logistics warehouse, my work has been entirely driven by what the machine tells me to do. So in the example you're talking about, let me use a slightly different example: social work, right? So social work is, it's not highly paid or valued, and yet it's going to become more and more important. We've got aging populations and all these other things. Now, to some extent, you could say, which is happening in countries like Japan, that humanoid robots or other kinds of automation in the home will help to provide some of that care. But at the same time, the human touch is really important. Yeah. So the examples that play out in this, the point I wanted to make is that typically what you would look at for, say, social workers or field engineers, things like that, is I will create a very clever scheduling system that will determine how I get the best use of the human resource. So you go there, your next job is there, you've got 15 minutes to do that one, 10 minutes to do that one. I'll put a tracker in your van or your car to see where you are, and I will control you. Right? And that has been driven by one idea, which is that I can create greater efficiency. But what do you think it does to the human?
It makes humans into robots.
Exactly.
Right?
It's disempowered me. It has, I can't control my world, and that is deeply disengaging. So there's a very interesting story of a social. So I'd use it as an example of social work because I wanted to illustrate it with a company called Bertzog, which is a Dutch social working organization, where they said, no, we're going to do that completely differently. We're going to allow the social workers to figure out how they optimize their work schedules and how they help each other to do their jobs. Yep. And in the end, first of all, people stay, they're far more engaged in the work. And secondly, that actually they're delivering better service to their clients. Sure. And it isn't just an efficiency, it's an effectiveness outcome as well. Yeah. So I think in your example, absolutely, we can use AI to help enhance what we do as humans in lots of examples. Sure. But what we have to be careful of is we're not creating a world where we just become the servants of the technology, not just from the point of view of engagement and motivation, all those other ideas, but frankly, that is also something, as you know, that scares an awful lot of people. Are we going to just be controlled by machines in the future?
It's a really good point, and I think it has to be kept in mind when we redesign work. I mean, when we look at, I always give this example, but we look at Rockefeller, Henry Ford, when they created the first type of conveyor belts. Where someone's putting in a window, the other one's putting in a wheel, and I really think that the modern workplace, where we have cubicles and we have teams that do very specific things, it's just a modern digital version of what was happening in the car conveyor belts, right? Yeah. And we have to be careful that with this new powerful technology, we just don't do the same thing and we make humans work for technology again. Exactly. It has to be the other way around.
Yeah, it does. And of course, that example very much leads into this discussion about robotics. And when we talk about jobs being displaced, the biggest displacement may well come through automation and robotics. Yeah. So we already can see, I mean, it's been true in Japan, it's certainly now true in China, of so-called dark factories. They may not actually be dark in terms of light, but they're dark because there's virtually no human intervention. Yeah. The whole system is being done by robots, which doesn't mean to say that there aren't good jobs for humans. I mean, actually, that is exactly where you need the human oversight, you need the human judgment. So something is controlling this whole system. But I quite like OpenAI's model, this layer model of the advances of AI, from the basic sort of chatbot stuff through to the agentic stuff, and then up into this idea of innovation and organizational automation. So we can absolutely see organizations that are going down that route that says, I'm going to automate an awful lot of this stuff. I still need some human oversight. But then the question is, so I can now do all of this stuff with far fewer people. And then we're back into other big social discussions, and we've touched on the sort of future work in some regards, of the concern of capital displacing labour. Now, that is not a new idea.
Yeah.
And many of you people will recognise that was the thing that drove a lot of thinking by people like Karl Marx.
Yeah.
Because he said, in that world, I am replacing people with robots who don't need feeding, they don't go on strike, they work 24/7. So arguably, from the owner of the business, I will get a better financial return. But what happens to all the people who have been displaced? And how do we create a world where we can share perhaps some of that benefit more broadly? So there are enormous questions of that kind. And it probably links also into this debate, which we all know is happening at the moment, which is, are we seeing the productivity benefits and gains from AI?
Yeah.
And one of my favourite models on this is known as the Solow paradox. You heard this one? So Robert Solow.
Mm-hmm.
So
Explain it for other people.
Yeah. So the American economist, I think he got a Nobel Prize for economics, back in the 1980s, early 90s, said that you could see technology everywhere, but in the productivity stats. Mm-hmm. And it was profoundly true. And I was doing a lot of work at Accenture at the time in doing precisely that. We were putting in big ERP systems and things like that. But it wasn't always clear, even though there might have been some benefit case for it, as to did it actually drive productivity outcomes. Mm. And this is the lag between, the hype reality lag. We are right in the midst of that now. For AI, the Solow paradox. So the lag between, I'm investing in all this stuff, I've automated this, have I seen the efficiency coming out? And that brings us back to the whole debate about human in the process and all these other ideas.
One thing, I think it's case by case. I think if we bundle all work up into one big bucket, we can have debates about, is it actually helping us or not? But for instance, example of this Plod Note Pro, for instance, I think it's relevant to bring it up now because it takes notes for me for all the meetings that I'm in. It does a bunch of things as well, and it's super thin. If you can see it on the camera, it's not a credit card; it's actually a note taker, an AI note taker, and it's like having a second brain, really. It can go to meetings with me. It can record my phone calls. All the fragmented conversations that I have with friends or thoughts that I can, tell myself when I'm walking in the park. It can capture all of that, and it can also be used inside conference rooms. Even as big as 5 meters, it can capture conversations, and people are talking over each other. So it's actually super useful, and it's got a little screen on it as well. So if you ever need to identify, how much battery is left, what is it doing, it's really, really handy. And during a meeting, for instance, it can capture audio. It can capture slides if we're talking about presentations in itself. So, like I mentioned, thoughts. And you can also flag key moments as well. So while it's recording, you can press a button if there's something really key that someone has said. And when you output the meeting notes there's over 10,000 different templates for different kinds of industries. It's very handy. It can tell us, who has different actions, X person has to do Y and Z and so on. So it's super handy. And it also has a feature called Ask Plod. So it's like your own personal AI assistant on top of all your data. And you can literally say things like, what happened, what did we discuss in the meeting last Tuesday at lunchtime, and things like that. And for people who work in regulated spaces like we do, it's fully compliant with GDPR,
Okay.
SOC 2, HIPAA. So yeah, look, I just wanted to bring it up because this is a very good example of, we go to a lot of meetings. We were discussing earlier, 60 meetings a week, 70 meetings a week, and we can't remember everything that's been said. And to me, this is a very useful way of using AI. Yeah. Because then I don't have to take notes.
Yeah.
It takes notes way better than I do, and it definitely remembers everything which I don't. So anyway, for anyone who's interested in this, actually, there'll be a link in the descriptions. There'll be a discount and so on. I think people should check it out. It's really, really cool. But anyway, let's get back to useful uses of AI, because that's a great example.
That is a very good example. And you can absolutely see how that can make us more efficient and effective. And people are using AI, and that's a great example right there of helping them to do some of their basic activities more efficiently.
Yeah.
Several questions that come from it. One, of course, is what do I do with that additional time? And so there's quite a lot of debate, going back to the productivity point, about, well, I think there was some survey a couple of years ago, wasn't there, from Microsoft or one of the big tech companies saying it was probably going to, Copilot was going to save about half an hour a day. And you think, but what am I going to do with that? I mean, can I measure that? Can I actually use it in some way effectively? But there's no doubt that tools like Claude help us to be more effective, and it's how we use that time. But there's another aspect of this which is causing concern, which is it going to diminish our cognitive abilities? And this is being debated more and more, and going back to some of the points we made about education. If every time some question pops into my head, I don't think about it, I just go straight onto my Gen AI tool or whatever and just ask the question, then is that going to lead to longer term cognitive decline? Because I'm not thinking anymore. I don't have to. So there's some really interesting sort of counterpoints to that. I think a tool like that is rather different. It's just helping me to organize my life, organize my thinking, recall things, which is really important. And I think there are a lot of great and very beneficial applications of AI that we're seeing. I think the question is how you then turn that into ultimately better outcomes and long-term benefits.
I've got some strong views on that, actually.
Yeah.
So maybe you've heard me say this before, but I have a bit of a campaign against lazy leaders. So people who are in positions of power or managing teams, which produce a large output for the company that they're in, just using AI to just do generally crappy processes faster.
Sure.
And I think what's going to happen, I know what happens is, you mentioned certain tools, which I'm a partner of, so I can't bring them up now, but you can't just put AI on top of what's already there. I think you have to redesign the way a company operates. What is the work that humans are going to do? What is the work that AI is going to do? How do we make them work together in a way that is cohesive? What is an overlaying system backbone that coordinates the work between humans and AI? Like ServiceNow, for instance, great platforms like that. And I think what's going to happen is, at first, people are going to be lazy, and they're just going to add AI, and they're going to hope that magic happens. And then they're going to realize it doesn't happen like that. It's not that easy. And I think the cognitive part is going to come into, okay, I have to redesign how this team works. I have to redesign how this company operates. I have to change the operating model of this company. And this is a company that's a bit like a race car. It's in a race against all the other competitors. And it's a furious race. There are sharp corners, there are ups and downs. And you're having to get people to change the engine of that race car while it's in a race. Yeah. I think mentally that's one of the most challenging things that we can do. Apart from, finding cures to diseases and infinite sources of energy and intergalactic, space discovery, all these other very difficult things. So my hope is that in this quest where we realize that we have to redesign our companies, we have to redesign our world, that will take all of the cognitive mental load we can think of. And then that will help us produce problem-solving skills and the new skills that we need going into the new world. That's my hope as an optimist, because I am an optimist.
Yeah, and I've agreed with all of that.
Right now it's not working.
Yeah. No, it's not.
Because people are being lazy, but it will eventually drive us towards it.
I wanted to build on that thought because I agree. I think, as the CIPD, we've done quite a lot of research on this sort of maturity ideas, how it would reflect that. So let's start with the leaders.
Sure.
We definitely have a significant gap in leadership in organizations at the executive and at the board level in their awareness and understanding of the potential real impacts of AI, as we've already touched on. So I think most organizations, let's start from a different perspective, not just the organization. Most individuals are using some of these tools.
Yep.
Right? What's fascinating about this era of technology is previous eras of technology, the so-called Industry 3.0 in particular, where we were implementing enterprise systems and things like that, was very much top-down, centrally driven. The organization decided, then rolled it out to their people. A lot of the benefits weren't realized because of the point you made earlier, which I used to describe as all we were doing is concreting over the cow paths. We were just slightly improving existing processes when what we should have done is rethink the entire process, and we used to call it business process reengineering.
Sure.
Didn't happen enough, so we didn't get all of the benefits. This era is very much bottom up. So we got a leadership that's often not aware of a lot of these things, and their organization, their people, of course they're starting to use these tools in all sorts of ways. So the first thing that we're seeing happening, and I've asked audiences this when I talk about these subjects for the last 3 years, well, in fact 4 years, a few months after ChatGPT was first launched, so what was that, November 22, I started to ask people, have anybody seen this stuff? Have you any using tools like this? A few hands might go up. And then I started to ask the question as more hands would go up. And I said, so you're using it, now put your hand up if you think your organization's got some kind of strategy around this stuff. And almost no hands go
Crickets.
up. Yeah. So what we're in a place at the moment of, if I think about it from a maturity cycle, is we're in this phase of experimentation. So most organizations today, not all, but I think many, let's put it that way, would say, yes, I am trying to create some framework within which I can encourage experimentation. That framework would be to make sure people aren't doing daft things and keeping data secure and so forth. But what we're really talking about is to step back from your whole operating model and even your business model and say, so how is this stuff going to affect my business? I mean, let's start with knowledge-based. Even an organization like mine, the CIPD, it's a professional body. We provide standards, training, content, research, learning, things like that, membership. We have 170,000 members around the world. How's that model going to change in the future? When an awful lot of what we might have provided in the past as proprietary research content to our membership, and like I said, well, I can get it on a Gen AI tool. That brings about other ideas like trusted sources and so forth. But we know that this stuff could profoundly impact our business model, so we're stepping back and saying, well, how do we respond to that? How do we understand what it might do to our profession in the future? And we might come back to a couple of thoughts on that. That's the strategic side of AI that we really need to think about. So you said, how's it going to affect my business model? And even if I'm not going quite that far yet, how's it, to your point, how's it going to affect my operating model? And how do I design, and this is what we would think of as strategic workforce planning, what are the jobs that I think I could anticipate in the future that might, some of which could be automated, how to design the right jobs, as we already discussed. And that's really is genuinely strategic thinking about my workforce, its capabilities, the skills I'm going to need, and then how I develop the future skills. And part of that is to create cultures which are more agile and responsive and adaptive, then we're not just blocking this stuff. What I teach my people to understand about these things, to use it responsibly, and how we experiment and learn and innovate in those sorts of ways, because nobody's written the manual for this stuff. You can't say, well, there's the best practice, let's just stop that. It's about experimentation and learning, but within an environment where we're understanding where this is taking us strategically. And that's really exciting stuff, but it is not where the vast majority of businesses are at this point in time.
I agree with you 100%. I was in a room recently with 50 CEOs. 50. I mean, it's hard to get in an intimate setting. It wasn't in a conference or anything, a natural dinner that was organized. And I got up there and spoke a little bit about, how I've helped companies transform and the frameworks I've used, my little playbook, which has worked quite well. And then I described what an AI strategy is. And after describing it for a few minutes, I said, okay, how many of you actually have an AI strategy? That's to this level of, of explanation and thought process. 2 CEOs put their hand up.
Wow.
And we're talking about some of the biggest companies in the UK.
Yep.
Not tiny little startups. So you're right. People at any rank are using AI, or they have access to some of it through work, or they're using their own personal AIs because nobody's told them they can't do that. Although it's ridiculous, they should not do that because data leak. But without the top-down strategy on exactly how far can they go?
Yeah.
What budget do they have? What are the areas of focus? What are the objectives for the year for AI usage?
How do we all learn from each other? What are the use cases? All these sorts of things.
They feel lost.
Yes.
They feel lost. It's like children in the classroom, like we spoke earlier, using AI without any leadership from the school teacher and from the school itself, and how it can be used and where it should be used and how it should be used. So it's a real shame, because if we don't have companies that know what they're doing with AI and are going to reimagine their operating models, we won't have many companies around. A lot of it's going to get consolidated into monopolies or duopolies.
Yeah.
And that's going to be a real problem.
No, absolutely. I think, I remember back in the day, we used to talk about ideas like change or die and so forth. But that was in an era when a lot of change was happening in the 80s and 90s, but not at this scale and speed, and not with this level of potential impact on businesses and business models and jobs and all these other things. So I think we're back to one of the fundamental questions, which is that, so how do I develop that thinking in organizations? What have I got to do to leaders to help them to understand some of this stuff?
And this is where I want to bring in the HR role. And obviously, CEO of CIPD, you focus on training people in HR. So what is a HR person to do in this new era? In this problem that we've just identified, how can a chief HR officer, senior HR professional help this happen in the right way?
I think in a number of ways, which we've already touched on some really key points about this. First of all, is just recognizing that for this stuff to really benefit us all, it is about the human with the system. It's the human with the technology. This is why I referenced at the very beginning of my own training and background in ergonomics, which is what I find so fascinating. So it is about how we therefore get the best out of both and shape the jobs of the future. So the HR profession should be bringing the people side of this. What is a good job? And we've done a lot of work, and it's not rocket science to say these are the dimensions of a good job. So let's use that as a North Star. Let's work closely with the technology teams to say, all right, we've got these fantastic tools which could automate these aspects of these tasks. And it really is understanding not just the job, but the breakdown of the job, the tasks and the processes that sit behind it. And then saying, all right, how can I reinvent those things and then recreate the role or the job for the person that gets the best out of them alongside the best out of technology. So you've got all those sorts of things. We've got the questions about ethical and responsible use, which are absolutely fundamental. And I'm not suggesting that our technology colleagues wouldn't understand some of these things, but I think HR has a very profound role in that too. Understanding corporate cultures, what is ethical and responsible use? And if we are going to shape, thinking through a strategic lens of our workforce for the future and realizing, oh my goodness, I could displace half my workforce, I could automate this, I could put robotics in over there. What's the moral responsibility that we might have to say, well, if I'm going to do that, how do I restructure the business in a way that is fair? And what happens to these people? Or even if I'm not doing something as drastic as that, but I know I'm having to change the kinds of skills that people need. I don't just immediately say, well, I have to get rid of that lot and hire a bunch of people over here, versus saying, no, isn't part of my responsibility, but also part of my strategic capabilities as an organization is to be able to upskill and reskill my workforce rapidly. And again, there's great opportunity for AI in that space. We're seeing some fantastic tools emerge now about personal coaching and bringing learning into the flow of work and all these sorts of ideas. So that is also a big HR agenda. How do we create the organizational agility by making sure that we can upskill and reskill very rapidly? So you've got it all the way from, as I said, this need to bring the people dimension into the job design, putting it into operating models which are using these things more broadly, understanding strategic workforce implications, and then working with the executive, working with the leadership on these things. What is, therefore, I think, really exciting about that, and I talk about it a lot with the profession, and there has got to be a shift in the profession to get into that place, because we've just participated in a global survey asking HR people around the world what they thought were the skills needed and where they thought the biggest gaps were, and no great surprise. So the skills needed are increasingly being recognized as the things I just described. Where are the biggest gaps? It's in the things I just described. So HR historically has been very buried in a lot of process and transactional stuff and the so-called talent management cycle and so forth. An awful lot of that we can benefit from agentic AI and other tools like that, which can make those processes much more efficient and much quicker, which will then give the capacity to say, all right, now we've got to shift into this new space. So I talk about it as a shift to the center of gravity of the profession. what we are now starting to see emerge is some very interesting examples of how the technology teams and the people teams come together. It was talked about a lot. It was about a year ago when Moderna, the big American pharmaceutical company, I think a lot of us got jabs, including myself, during the COVID
Myself
crisis,
included,
where they combined the two functions.
Mm-hmm.
They literally said, we're going to bring together the people function with the technology function because they need to be intimately working together. And interestingly, they put the chief people officer in charge of it. Now, that was a very strong signal about a direction of travel. And I do think that we're going to see a lot more of that.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, what it is also pointing out is that in most businesses, traditional operating models, things are very siloed. I got my digital and technology team over here, I got my people team over there, I got my finance team over there, I got my marketing team over there. We are in a world where this has all got to start to come together far more. You could describe the things that we're trying to solve now as wicked problems, and the classic definition of a wicked problem is you have to think about them very multidimensionally. And if we think about implementation of AI in the ways we've just described as a wicked problem, I mean, which is not to, there aren't massive opportunities, but that's how they would technically be described. We have got to work better across the business functions that can engage on this to drive these operating models and this strategic thinking for the future. And I personally think that's a really exciting prospect. But we've got to recognize where the gaps are and how we're going to build those capabilities and skills in not just the people profession, but other functions as well.
I'm going to have a little bit of a rant.
Yeah.
And I think together we can try to find solutions for this problem I'm going to have a rant about. So we're seeing a lot of news stories coming out, Oracle being one of them, firing 30,000 people by email. And you would imagine that a chief HR officer had to approve that at some point.
Yeah.
But the problem then is, we are the sum of the people that we hang around with and we interact with. And a company is only as good as its people. I mean, there's almost no point in a company if it doesn't have great people. And a great leader hires great people, right? So it's all about people. But then, I go to quite a lot of management offsites and board meetings, and quite often I don't hear the chief HR officer speak much.
Yeah.
For a couple of reasons. One, they've been beaten into submission. Go and hire me great people at the lowest possible price. And every time they do bring up the human element, and it all starts to sound maybe a bit too fluffy, a bit too lovey-dovey, and certain types of leaders don't like that. They want to know the numbers. They want to know what's the return on investment. This lovey-dovey, fluffy stuff you're telling me about looking after my people, what's the return on investment? I can't see it. What's the cost of rehiring? I don't know. It's not clear. So it's no wonder that a lot of HR leaders have turned into just order takers. Mm-hmm. I'm going to fire these 20,000 people, go and work it out. In the most, not in the most humane way, but in the way that I'm not going to get sued. So how do we correct that? How do we change the position of a HR leader in those board meetings, in those strategy offsite meetings, usually in beautiful locations? How do we encourage HR leaders to be a little bit more courageous, to really speak up, but also fight their ground? Mm-hmm. What's happening there? Are you seeing the same things? I'm having a rant here of what I'm seeing, but you're far more embedded into the HR profession than I am.
Yeah, I mean, it would be very hard to disagree with a lot of what you said. And it goes back a little bit into some of the history of the profession and things like that. But it's an extraordinary phenomenon in a way when I think about it, the sort of history of work, as to how we've moved so much into this sort of quantitative world. I mentioned scientific management and job design, which weren't jobs designed by anything other than the most efficient thing to do is just shove a person into that part of the process. Yeah. And yet, as you've pointed out, I mean, people are the essence of business. They're the creativity, they're the value drivers. They also, interestingly, create the biggest risk. This is just one point that triggers my mind. When I talk about HR, I think about it in sort of three main dimensions. Mm-hmm. So one of it is to protect the company from risk. And the biggest risk in companies is people. Mm-hmm. I mean, let's take cybersecurity and fraud. It's not that, yes, of course, we've got to get the technology right, but the biggest risk is people doing dumb things.
But I think it's unfair to say this because people are the essence of the business.
Yes,
right?
They are.
Everything that's the essence of anything will be the biggest, core point of everything, of risk, of benefit.
Yeah. So the point about the sort of three dimensions. So the function, the HR profession has a role to protect the organization from risk, like every function does.
Sure.
And part of the risk is making sure I'm not hiring bad people. It's making sure that I understand conflict in the workplace. It's making sure that if people do go a little bit off track and start to do things that could disrupt the business, that I deal with those sorts of things.
Sure.
And that I'm training them in ways so they don't cause a problem around, say, cyber fraud or whatever it might be.
Sure.
So you got that, and let's not forget all the regulation stuff, which has just been keeps growing. So risk and compliance is a big part of what the profession does, and it's not generally very popular. And a lot of people say it's just HR trying to control things, but we do have a responsibility on that. The other part of it is cost, because the largest part of cost in the vast majority of businesses is people. So we have an oversight role in terms of understanding cost, and a lot of what you just described in Oracle, wherever it is, this restructuring that's going on, and that's, if there is a word for the year. Last year, I think restructuring was probably right up there. We were in difficult economic times, and then people say, well, I'm going to restructure the business, a.k.a. I'm going to lose people.
Sure.
And hence, as you said, the role of the people profession. Interestingly, I saw a lot of businesses saying it's because we're using AI, and I think actually that was a smokescreen in many cases.
Yeah.
And we might come back to what's happening in some of the tech companies, because I think that is less of a smokescreen, but in many cases it was. Sure. But the third dimension is this value point. It's about recognizing, as you said, that the real value in an enterprise will come from its people, how they're engaged, how they're trained, how they're aligned, what their accountabilities are, and how we drive things like productivity and performance, which we know is absolutely crucial, this whole debate about productivity puzzles, and everybody looking around for people saying, who's responsible for that? Well, maybe HR should have been responsible for it. Well, yes, I think we should understand things like productivity, but we can't do it on our own.
Yeah.
So then there's an education thing. What I found with business leaders is that because of the way that HR has often been positioned or has acted, it is seen as a sort of bit of a Cinderella function. It doesn't understand business value and things like that. And yet, if you think about the things that are really top of the agenda for businesses today, there are a lot of the things I just described. People risk and leadership capability.
Exactly.
Have they got the right skills? Is my culture something I understand? But I echo a thought that you expressed, Danilo. I remember years ago talking to a chief executive about it, and he said, Peter, let me tell you what the problem is with HR. And I thought, here we go, another lecture on what the problem with HR is.
Yeah.
And he said, the problem with HR is you bring too much PowerPoint and not enough Excel. I thought, well, that's an interesting way of expressing it. I said I would not deny that part of the problem that HR has had for a very long time is it is not good enough on the evidence and the analytics and the data.
Sure.
So things like real cost of hiring, or what, even silly things like what my headcount is, which we sometimes still disagree with finance. So I would not disagree that we've got to get better at analytics and data and quantitative stuff. But at the same time, you cannot run your business by only understanding quantitative metrics.
Of course. Yeah.
I mean, the example I always use is culture. You can't say, well, my culture is 3 out of 5, so everything's great. Culture is a much broader conceptual understanding. Now, it doesn't mean to say I can't bring evidence and help you understand what is going on, because the thing about culture, in my experience with business leaders, is when you talk to them about it, what they will describe as the culture they would like it to be, not necessarily the culture that it is.
Sure.
And there is not one single culture in an organization.
Sure.
But they know it's important. So we are at, I think, a very critical point for the profession, whereas, and I've been saying this for a long time, that the profession has got to step up.
Yeah.
It has got to equip itself to have, as you rightly said, the courage of its convictions. Because the other thing that's interesting about HR is it does sit between management and the workforce. Now, interestingly, the workforce has been accusing HR for quite some time, is you're now just a stooge of management.
Sure.
As you said, management's decided we need to sack people, so okay, over to HR and you do it. The truth is, HR has the responsibility to understand both sides of this equation. And we have got to have the courage to challenge management from time to time and say, well, I know you might think that restructuring this is the best thing, just fire a whole bunch of people by text or email. That is not the right thing to do. There are alternatives to that approach. We could reskill people or whatever it is. And understanding from a workforce side. So this idea of stepping up is to have, to complete the thought of capability, confidence, and credibility to operate at that really strategic levels of business, as we've been exploring, to drive the future of that organization in ways that our profession can really, really help with. But to get there, we've got to invest more in ourselves, and we've got to take ourselves, and you wouldn't surprise you to hear me say this as responsible for the professional body. We have got to professionalise the function.
Yeah.
You know, over the years, I've met so many HR people who said, I'd say, tell me about your career in HR. And I said, well, I wasn't very good with numbers and I didn't really understand technology, but I like people.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, that's interesting because actually numbers is the language of business. You've got to understand technology for what we've been describing. And liking people is not a qualification.
Yeah.
In fact, many people in HR sometimes say it helps if you don't like people because of some of the tough stuff we have to do. So this is a really, really important time. Without using a rather hackneyed phrase, I think it is an inflection point for business, and I think it is definitely an inflection point for HR. Because if we do not, as a profession, step into the kind of space that we've been describing, somebody will. Because this stuff must be done. We must bring the human element to all of the things we've been talking about. And I think that is fundamentally what the profession is about, but it is not where it's been positioned enough in the past. So, I always talk about these things a lot. I'm very frank with the profession when I talk about these things. And I said, look at this as an opportunity. And it is an opportunity, but you're not going to get there by thinking I can just muddle along, that I don't need to worry about continuous professional development or being innovative and creative and having the courage of my convictions. I'm going to have to do those things in order to make the impact that I truly believe we need to.
Yeah. I mean, in Oracle's case, 30,000 people got fired in a day. And this was the company's record-breaking revenue results. So it wasn't even because of results. It wasn't even because of anything else other than you just decided. Yeah. In that case, and look, I'm not picking on the chief HR officer of Oracle. I'm sure that they are good people, but that should have never been approved. It doesn't make it's not humane.
It's not humane.
The way it was done was not humane. I understand 30,000 people. How do you speak to 30,000 people, right? You have to automate it in some way. But the whole thing is just not right. And you mentioned regulation.
Yeah.
Surely the government can get a little bit more involved in something like this.
They could. I mean, it brings out a sort of wider thought. Let me start with that. Business over the last 30, 40, 50 years, as long as I've been around, commercial business, has been driven by the profit motive.
Yeah.
In fact, it was expressed by another American economist, Milton Friedman, who back in the 70s said that the sole purpose of certainly a quota company or a commercial company is to make profit. The sole purpose, right? So damn everything else, you just got to make money for your shareholder. As time has moved on, I think a number of really important things have emerged. One is, who is my shareholder? Mm-hmm. So, we know that a vast majority of stocks are traded by machines. Yeah. Yes, of course, there are long-term shareholders in businesses like pension funds, but still, you say, who am I really appealing? When I say the financial stakeholder, who am I really talking about? Now, that is not to deny that, of course, the people that are backing the business financially are a critical stakeholder of business. But what are the other stakeholders of business? Well, let me start with employees and the workforce. They're a stakeholder in the business as well. Mm-hmm. We talked about engagement and motivation. If I think I'm just going to be treated like some widget that can be discarded at the first sign of trouble or whatever, that doesn't create any kind of loyalty for me or any sense that I would stay with that organization. So employees need to be seen as a stakeholder. Customers need to be seen as a stakeholder. Mm-hmm. And you can see a lot of businesses that, frankly, have not treated their customers well, or they exploit their customers. I mean, going back to these ideas about social media and what needs to change, don't you think that in many ways you could regard that as an exploitation of a customer?
Sure. And
people have always said that if you don't pay for the product, you're the product. Suppliers are a stakeholder of a business. If I don't have a good relationship with my suppliers and I don't treat them well and fairly, I won't have a business. And yet how many businesses have mistreated their suppliers and used their power of buying to suppress and drive down profitability down the supply chain and force them to meet the profitability targets of the end consumer or the end company? So you got the financial stakeholder, you've got the employees, you've got the customers, you've got the suppliers, and then to complete it, you've got the communities of which you are part. And I've long believed this is true of business, that business in the past, I think, felt itself very separate from society. We have these financial shareholders we've got to take care of, and nothing else really matters. I think what has emerged in recent years is not only what I've been describing as the multi-stakeholder view of the world, but it is also the recognition that, as I've put it, that business is not apart from society, it is a part of society. And you can see that, of course, with all of the things that we've been dealing with in recent years, like the expectations of our workforce and purpose that people talk about, and social change impacting how we have to treat people at work. And it's not work is here and life is there. They're integral. And then the final stakeholder is the environment. Mm-hmm. So this idea of multi-stakeholder capitalism, some people talk about it, and how regulators are beginning to look at this, and it's been framed in ideas like this ESG stuff, so environmental, social and governance questions, which is about greater transparency of businesses, not just reporting their financial results, which after all anyway are all backward-looking, but to report on other things, like how they're treating their workforce, what they're investing in people, things like, I don't know, gender pay gaps and other ideas like that, or what you're doing in terms of social impact that make a difference, or tell me what your purpose is beyond just making money for financial stakeholders. So that's how regulation has moved. Now, what is interesting there, what is challenging, is that but then when times get hard, a lot of that stuff tends to go out the window.
Sure.
So you're back to the point that you made earlier, which is that a lot of these ideas, of course, are being expressed, say, through the HR profession. We have these other responsibilities. Sure. We have to treat our workforce properly. But when times get hard, that's all very interesting and it's all very nice, but businesses can't exist on altruism alone.
Yeah.
But it does bring, that interesting point that you made, which is when you look at companies like Oracle, and it's fascinating, isn't it, when you look at this restructuring that's going on, which goes back to which companies are really implementing AI first and farthest, the tech companies.
Yep.
So it isn't just Oracle, it's Amazon, it's Microsoft. A lot of them have been going through letting go people because they're saying these jobs are being now increasingly done by automation. Professional services firms also talking about this stuff. We talked about entry-level jobs, but it's more than that. They're also saying, I'm now going to judge your performance as a manager or even a director or a partner or whatever by how much you're using the AI tools. And I find that really interesting.
I've seen a lot of this as well. A lot of management kind of embedding new metrics around, yes. So, for instance, if you're a developer, you only get your bonus if you're using so many tokens a year.
Yeah.
And they're doing this for every line of work. But then, someone can just go on and just, make pictures of bananas all day to use up their tokens so they can meet their metrics. Again, it's lazy approach, right? Lazy leadership again, and just a lazy way of thinking of things. Put in a number and we'll magically solve everything. Yeah. Let's go back a little bit to...
So just a quick thought on that point. It points to another big challenge in business is what are we measuring?
Sure.
So I think a couple of adages I've always believed in. One is generally what gets measured gets done. So if I'm not measuring it,
very true,
then I'm probably not going to be doing it, right? Because there's no sense of accountability. But the hard thing is what I measure. And there's a great quote, I'm probably going to make a mess of it, but there's a great quote by Einstein who said that not everything that's counted counts, not everything that counts is counted. In other words, we tend to naturally focus on the easy things to count.
Makes sense.
So using those examples, it's more easy for me to count things like how many times I might have used an AI tool because I can track the usage of it. Is that the right thing to count? I'm not sure that it necessarily is. I mean, again, it's a crude way of saying I want people to start to use these tools, but it's not talking much about the outcome. So we have a lot of measures that tend to relate to input and not enough that relate to and understand output and outcome, which certainly, again, echoes the thought we've already touched on, which is this whole idea of productivity and why it's such a puzzle. Because in most organizations, in my experience, they don't really measure product. It's very hard to understand it. If I take some aspects of jobs, you can measure it much more clearly. I mean, you might say I can measure the sales productivity, or I can measure if it's an assembly line, how many cars have been produced at what cost and so forth. But there are an awful lot of jobs in the economy of today which are actually quite hard to measure. We don't train managers well enough, and this is another big issue we have to face, which is we have got to invest in training our line managers to be better people managers in a world where we've got more diversity of teams with very different expectations, people working in lots of different ways. But we've also got to train managers to focus more on what they are producing, not just how many tokens of input they used or how many
Sure.
hours they sat in front of a computer screen.
Sure.
And that does take quite a shift in thinking. And it's got to start with this idea of, so what is it important that we most measure?
Mm-hmm.
And acknowledging that truism of Einstein is that we've been measuring for years the easy things to count. And even going back to financial metrics, as I said, they're all backward-looking.
Sure.
What do you think is the biggest part of organization value today? It's so-called intangible. It's now reached something like 70-80% of market value is so-called intangible.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, I can't see it on your balance sheet and I can't see it in your P&L statements. It is much more about things like your brand, your reputation, your culture, your knowledge, your people, how they're engaged. It's those sorts of things. And that's where value is coming from, to your earlier point.
Sure.
But we just don't have very good ways of measuring it. And we need to work, going back to my point about collaborating between functions, that's not just a problem of HR. That's as much a problem of finance.
Yeah.
Well, they've been talking about intangibles for years. Well, how are you going to start to get a better line of sight if this is making up the bulk of your market value? You have got to get a better line of sight on what these things are.
Yeah, I mean, there's two ways of looking at all this. I think the pessimist in me thinks, wow, it's all broken. And it's been going on for so long, it's very hard to correct it. And it's very hard for a company to start correcting it, because if they start behaving in a different way, they'll become less competitive in a traditional way of measuring things. And then the optimist in me thinks, wow, there's so many things to fix. And once we do fix it, it's going to be wonderful because we're going to see so many benefits out of it. And I guess, we can all jump in and out of both camps, even, in a single day. Yeah. It seems like it does go back to government, though. But again, if a single country decides to do something differently, that impacts the competitiveness of that country in the traditional way of measuring things. So then again, we're talking about global collaboration. And now in the times we're in, it looks less likely than it was many years ago of even getting to that place. So, I mean, I don't want to put you in a corner or make you say anything you don't want to say, but given all of this, are we not just spiraling out of control?
There is a danger. I mean, everybody talks about the dystopian future and the utopian future, and how do we understand what is going on? Clearly, the dystopian future would be more likely in a world where we see this as a war or a fight, which is both ideologically driven, politically driven, and everything else. And so the language that comes out of leaders around the world at the moment about, well, we need to dominate in terms of AI or robotics or whatever it is, and this is a fight for the leadership. You think, but that's not how the world's going to work effectively, is it? If we just see this as a competition and a fight between countries, then where is that? You are in danger of that spiraling out of control.
Yeah.
I think there are massive risks that come with AI. And interestingly, some of the, as you know, the tech bros and people like Stephen Hawking and others have said we could be on the cusp of creating the greatest threat that mankind has ever faced, which is AI out of control. And if we're creating a world where it's competitive, so then my instinct, if it's a competitive world, is to hide what I'm doing as opposed to being open and transparent, then the risk that we will go down a route where either we could lose control of AI or we don't understand quite what it is doing, which I think we're already in that space in many cases, aren't we? Take a simple example when we're trying to understand some tool, and we're now seeing employment tribunals come on this. So going back to recruitment. So I did not get recruited by your company because of your algorithm. And I'm going to take you to court because I think, or a tribunal, because I think that your technology was biased. And then the people are looking at this thing, sort of not even sure how this stuff works.
Sure. Yeah.
So extrapolate that up into a more global scale where do we really understand half of the things that these tools are already doing and are capable of doing, magnified by the fact that we're going to hide it anyway because this is about some sort of global competitive thing. That's where you get into this dystopian threat of things getting a bit out of control. So I suppose going back to your point, is this about government and regulation? And absolutely it is, but at the same time, I've long observed that how does regulation keep up with a world which is changing so fast? I mean, I remember when Mark Zuckerberg came over, when it was 3 or 4 years ago, maybe slightly longer now, and he appeared in front of select committees in Parliament, just like he'd appeared in front of Senate and House committees in the US, where, in quotes, these regulators were trying to see how do we hold to account somebody like Zuckerberg and Meta. He was miles down the road ahead of where they were. And the kinds of questions just illustrated how little they understood. So we got this disparity of power based on knowledge and understanding. And therefore, as you know, a lot of the debates emerging more recently, and a lot of these more philosophical debates about where AI is going, is who's in control. And is it the tech bros that now have this immense power and wealth that are driving us in a particular direction, which we don't understand, and I'm pretty damn sure, I'm not sure they understand either. I mean, another example, the pursuit of AGI and what has been described as a singularity. If we truly get, in all the billions of dollars going into it, to get to systems that are way more capable of humans at almost anything that we do, it's been described as that we then approach a singularity. And the singularity is what happens next. What the hell happens when we've created this technology? Can we control it? Is it controlling us? And that's the singularity. It could bounce off in all sorts of different directions. And so, government has a role, but I think there's got to be a much more fundamental debate about the responsibility of the big tech companies. And going back to another example we used earlier, like social media, I said that in the end, I think regulation can help, but you've also got to have the buy-in from the tech companies to say, we are going to change our algorithms so they don't just constantly say whatever you ask is brilliant and I'm just going to operate as an echo chamber because that keeps you sucked in, or doom scrolling and all these other things which we know are so destructive. So I think it has to be a combination between governments starting to think how we're going to work more collaboratively on these things, the regulatory environment that tries to control some of these parameters, but it has to involve, in particular the tech companies, but not just them, businesses in general, because this is also about how we implement this stuff in business, not just what the tech companies create, and how that all comes together into a much wider discussion that we're going to need more and more, and in fairly short order, to make sure that we don't end up into the kind of places that you just touched on.
We'll get back to the whole world order thing and what might happen. One thing I wanted to go back, because I think you have a unique insight on this, is what are the new things coming up in the workplace, like new issues because of AI, things happening in tribunals that weren't happening before, disputes which are happening inside of companies between employees, employers. What are the new any kind of funny stories as well, if you have any, because of AI? Any interesting takes on a trend you're seeing on typical issues which are coming up more, or any funny stories you have around that?
I mean, the first one we've already talked about quite a bit, which is about recruitment and how much is affecting recruitment and how I go about recruitment and all the rest of it. There are some very interesting ones around litigation. So every time I talk to employment lawyers, they're sort of throwing their arms up in the air and saying, oh my God, I cannot believe the number of claims that we are now receiving. And they'll say that I'm getting 50-page claims from these people saying I've been discriminated against, I've been bullied, I've been harassed, or whatever the hell, right? And they're saying what they are doing is they're simply using AI. They are saying, they may feel a bit disgruntled, or maybe they've been made redundant and they're not happy with the redundancy terms. So I think, well, why don't I just go on to any of these Gen AI tools and ask you that question? Say, I'm a middle-aged black woman or whatever it might be. I think I've been discriminated against, and I want you to create the case for me. AI, back to my earlier point, AI doesn't come back and say, well, let me ask the question of why do you think that? What might be the evidence? Just says, here's all the things that you should present back to your employer. And then they just cut and paste, and you've got 50 pages of this stuff coming back to employers saying, I've got a case. And then it goes on to the employment lawyers. I mean, again, it's a cycle. How do we break that cycle? And I think, we've got to train and educate people more. And I'm not disagreeing. There are far too many cases of bad behaviours in organisations and people have been treated badly or discriminated against. That is not the point. And we need to train managers better. But we can't end up in a world where everybody just thinks, whatever happens to me, I'm going to litigate because I can get all this clever stuff off AI. And I don't have to pay a lawyer to do it. So those are things that are emerging. And as I've already mentioned, therefore, the tribunal cases coming up based on things like that, but also based on, I think the stuff that you put in place is biased against me. And unfortunately, yes, there is bias, as we've already said. I mean, we are training systems on biased content. But I've also always believed that if we get this right, and it's back to the human judgment in the loop, that AI could be the greatest mirror we've ever created on human bias so that we really understand it.
Agreed. Yeah.
And I think that's an opportunity. So got those things going on. Other things that are clearly concerning people in the workplace are things like monitoring.
Mm-hmm.
And now the truth is that for a long time,
Big Brother and monitoring.
big brother and monitoring. So for a long time, I could feed into your laptop and I could know exactly what keystrokes you're making, how often you're doing stuff. Some people get wise to this. I've heard of people literally leaving things on their keyboard, which is keeping keys depressed while they go around and do something else to try to show that they're at work. It's the old analogy of people in the workplace, because this is happening more, that risk, or businesses see it as a risk anyway, of people working remotely. They're not quite sure what they're up to. And it's the old analogy of people coming into the office and putting their jacket on a chair, then buggering off to have coffee somewhere else. Mm-hmm. It's the same idea. So then if I'm being monitored, then I'm going to play that game too.
Yeah.
And I can find ways to make it look like I'm still on my machine and it's still active.
Sure.
But definitely one of the worries in the workplace, but it's also societally true, is monitoring. That everything I do is being monitored and controlled. Everything I'm saying is being recorded. People worried for a long time about their phones are listening to them, and they are responding accordingly. And of course, in the workplace, that has other levels of challenge, which is that, so am I not trusted by my organization? So the more that we think that we've got to monitor people to understand what they're doing, maybe in the interest of productivity, the more people will feel they're just being controlled. And there have been a lot of examples of this over the years. I mean, there are stories of people having monitors on their desks, back pre-COVID, so pre a lot of those sort of tools now, where organizations would put some kind of monitors on their desks that could say whether the person was at their desk or not. You think, is that what we're trying to do?
It's sad.
So, it is sad. So I think there are some very important points in all of that are definitely concerning people. And we've talked about other things like job displacement and so forth. But this whole monitoring thing, I think, is a really interesting question.
It goes back to what you said before about measuring the wrong things just because it's easy to measure.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So the fact that I mean, if I'm working remotely, I mean, this has also been one of the big revolutions in work, isn't it? And I've often compared it to evolution. Evolution didn't go in steady; it went fits and starts. It took a big crisis to shift our thinking about work, and that, of course, was the COVID crisis. But the great thing is, and we've changed our language from the idea of work-life balance, which implies I've got work and then I've got life, to saying no, work-life integration. I'm the same person at work that I am in the rest of my life, and the things that matter to me, therefore matter in work as much as they might matter in life. But also this idea that I can be more flexible in how I work because I have other accountabilities and responsibilities. It's also good for inclusion. When we talked about more women in the workplace, if they're still having predominantly the caring responsibilities, it's quite hard to work in an environment where I've got to be in the office 5 days a week. So these are really important changes. But how we, again, going back to the point about educating our managers and what they're looking for in terms of performance, what they're measuring, is not just about having gizmos on my laptop or whatever to say how many keystrokes I hit or how many hours I sat in front of a computer screen.
I think it's all about discussion, right? If a chief HR officer approached the subject and said, look, it's really important that we monitor certain things. For instance, if we're noticing that you're swearing a lot in Teams communications, we're starting to realize maybe that you're angry. Maybe something your manager should help you with. That's useful. But, I guess the way to make it fair would be to leave the data open to everybody. So I can see my own data and my HR business partner can see my data, but I can also see it.
Yes.
I can see what's being monitored. I can see what's being collected on me, and I can choose to request for it to be deleted if I want to. A bit more open and transparency would be great, I think, in that area.
I think that's absolutely true.
That's one way to solve it. It's a kimono, right? It's on the table.
You take an awful lot of the heat out of the debate if you are honest and transparent about what you're capturing in terms of information. And actually, it is protected under GDPR and other things. Anyway, what information am I collecting on you? But secondly, and equally critically, is what am I doing with that information? So we know there are lots of examples of that. I mean, let's take a really important part of inclusion. So we're all trying to understand the makeups of our workforces, and one of the really important areas is things like disabilities. So we know, across the population and in both physical and mental differences and disabilities, that it affects roughly a quarter of the population. We know that we have one of the biggest segments outside of gender in terms of being able to get people working more effectively and people not having the opportunity to work as people with disabilities. Ask them in the workplace, do you have a disability? So one of the biggest challenges is so-called hidden disability.
Sure.
Now, a lot of people just won't say. Now,
Yeah.
why won't they say? They won't say because they don't trust what you're going to do with the information.
They don't feel safe.
They will feel judged.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it is about those two things, about what am I collecting, but most importantly, why, and then what am I going to do with it? So it is about you being able to see what you're doing, but also knowing that a lot of the information maybe it's just anonymized because I'm just trying to get a general sense of the culture and how people are behaving, not specifically targeting you.
Yeah.
So you got a lot of those questions emerging. But the other point that I find interesting about technology now is that I can read your facial expression. And to your point about having cameras or on Zoom calls, and from the recruiter side, yes, I'm tracking things now like eye movement because that will help me understand that maybe you're reading stuff. But more than that, I can read your facial expression. And we've known for quite some time that technology is now better at reading human expression than humans are on critical things like whether you're lying or not.
Sure.
It's much higher
Yeah.
accuracy on things like that. But it can also read a lot of other things too. I mean, I think it was a guy called Ekman who many years ago developed this sort of categorization of human facial expressions. The human face is extraordinary, got a lot of muscles in it. And I think he categorized something like 3,000 different facial expressions. There are many, many different ways. And of course, we know it's a critical part of emotional intelligence. We know, for example, people with autism can't read facial expressions. Technology is very, very good at it.
Sure.
And people will even say things like it can detect things like your sexuality or even your political leanings. And you think, hold on a second.
Yeah.
So this starts to get very personal. But I use it in a slightly different way, which is we're always trying to understand what's the mood of the workforce, are people happy or not? And I keep saying, well, if you've got cameras in your offices tracking everybody's facial expression, you will know.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You can see whether they're happy or disgruntled or upset or whatever. But that again, I mean, okay, so the technology is possible. Is that ethical? Should we be doing stuff like that?
Yeah.
It's back into this whole monitoring debate that we just had.
I'll give you another conundrum. I was recently with a billionaire who owns the largest private school chain in the world, and one thing that we were discussing about the future of education, and we're kind of designing this new system, this new type of school. And one thing that came up is, well, we need to get teachers to do less administrative work, no marking of exams. No need to kind of do the register every morning to see who's in class. So how do we do that? And the only way to do it is by putting facial recognition cameras in the schools. And gosh, that touches a real sensitive topic, right? Because we have facial recognition cameras in a school, but we're talking about children. And then what do you do if half the parents don't allow you to do that? But we do want to take away the administrative work of teachers so they can concentrate more on the actual kids, and then the teachers are less stressed out.
Yep.
And they're able to be better coaches and better mentors for the kids. So that's a really tough one. That's a really tough one.
It is. I mean, it's another really interesting conundrum around this whole thing of I can monitor you in so many different ways, and particularly as you get into children, young adults, and so forth, that problem magnifies itself.
Yeah.
But yes, of course, the principle that teaching is a good example of so many others. I mean, we've talked about it quite a bit, that the idea that technology can reduce the less value-adding stuff, the admin tasks. People talk about robotics getting rid of the difficult, dirty, and dangerous jobs.
Yeah.
They're all part of it. But it just goes back to my earlier point that so we've got to look at the tasks and things that teachers do in the round to understand how we're going to deal with some things and not just jump on one particular thing.
Sure.
So if I just do that, then it'll solve the problems.
Sure.
And that is part of the challenge of job and work design. You've got to think very holistically. You've got to break down the tasks, understand them. Where might automation or technology either remove or enhance that task and activity? Then how do I reconstruct what I really want the teacher to be doing?
Sure.
But they are definitely some of the bigger questions and threats we face.
Just something I've been wanting to say actually since we've been talking, and I do need to caveat that I am an advisor at CIPD, but the reason why I fell in love with CIPD is because of the magazines you guys have and the conferences you have. And I did notice a very stark difference between people that were CIPD trained and certified versus HR people that were not, because I've been managing people my whole life. I had teams as big as 1,000 people at one point. And when I had a HR business partner or a chief HR officer working with me that was CIPD trained, I noticed a massive difference.
Oh, that's good.
And I'm not just saying that because I'm,
Yeah.
I do advise organization. It's the whole reason why I even approached the organization to help you guys on your AI journey. How can we make people recognize that more? Because in all of these issues that we're describing, things are just going to get more complicated. We're going to have a lot more conundrums, a lot more, polarizing opinions about the same subject. Surely it goes back to good training, good foundations for people that work in HR to be able to deal and advise on these topics for other leaderships. So what's your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, we touched on that a little bit before. It's about...
My personal thought is that it should be mandated.
Yes.
I mean, like an accountant has to go and do the ACA qualifications. A lawyer has to do the bar exam.
Yeah.
I see the HR profession so important, especially now. It's always been. It has always been, but especially now with all of these intricate issues coming up.
Yes.
Why can't we get the government to just mandate that all HR professionals do the equivalent of the bar exam for lawyers? Like
we have absolutely talked about that. The
this has to happen.
Of a license to practice, because completely in agreement, of course, that as we've discussed, this is a critical time for the profession really to step up and to make sure it's got the qualifications, the skills, the continuous professional development, the standards, the values that all are part of what it means to be a professional, whether you're an accountant or anything else. And ultimately, we have talked about this idea that shouldn't the profession ultimately become one of a license to practice. Now, the interesting thing about license to practice is that apart from things like audit, I could hire an unqualified accountant, but I just wouldn't do it.
Exactly.
Why would I hire an unqualified accountant?
Okay, exactly.
So there's something on it's the demand and supply side. Yeah, so we're trying to work on both sides. We're trying to work on the organizational side to say, why on earth would you hire an untrained or unqualified HR person? And if you do, then surely one of the first things you want to do is train them up or put them through the qualifications in order so that they do get certified and they do become a member of the professional body.
And we're not, Peter, we're not just talking about knowing how to deal with people.
No.
There are rules and regulations around how to dismiss someone.
Oh, exactly.
How to deal with a disciplinary action.
Yeah.
And yes, you can go read all of this, but being trained on the scenarios, the case studies, when a company got it right and wrong, these are all the things CIPD trains people on. So I just don't get it. I've been scratching my head the whole time. In the year or so they've been working together, like, just why isn't this mandated? It's driving me insane. Imagine you as the CEO.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one to mandate when we are so far away from having the sort of majority. I mean, if you look at the UK, I mean, the interesting thing about the profession, if you look at it in a global context too, so the CIPD has been around for over 100 years, and it's taken us over 100 years to get to a place where we have roughly half of the population of people that would really regard themselves as being within the sort of broader people profession. And it goes back to what we talked about before, a lot of the legacy of the profession where it was not treated seriously, didn't take itself seriously, it was caught in a lot of the muck and weeds of admin and things of that nature.
Sure.
So to suddenly jump to say you've all got to be doing this is quite a big leap, but it should be a direction of travel. So what we said is let's try and build a momentum and across the profession, both from the employer side and within the people that work within the profession, that why on earth wouldn't I do this? Why would I not see that to build, as I've described it, the credibility, the confidence and the capability, and you added courage to that, in order to act into the world that we're talking about now, that I must be not only be qualified or have my CPD, but I'm part of a professional community. I have standards and values that I apply. We have a profession map that describes these skills and competencies as well. And interesting, at the very heart of the profession map, we talk a lot about behaviors and values as much as we talk about competencies and skills. We also talk about the idea that at the heart of the profession map is understanding business. So going back to the points we were making before. So before we even start to talk about all these different aspects of HR, from recruitment and resourcing and so on, it's do you understand the fundamentals of business and making business cases, understanding cost, understanding these three dimensions I talked about. So the risk and compliance stuff, which means absolutely understanding things like employment law.
Mm-hmm.
The cost side, so you really do understand, cost of people, full cost, total reward, and understand if you're going to restructure, how to understand, what that's doing to the cost of the business and how that drives business outcomes. And critically, this whole point about value. How am I driving performance and improvement in culture and all these other things that, of course, HR aspires to do. So there is a direction of travel for sure, but there is something about also business leaders demanding this of the profession. Because I've also said many times that sometimes businesses get the HR they deserve. If I'm a business leader that doesn't really understand this stuff and doesn't really value it and doesn't understand the sort of strategic nature of a lot of things that we talked about and the people side of business, I just want a compliance person that will do what I tell them to do.
Yeah.
Go fire people. And I've met a lot of senior HR people have found themselves in that kind of environment and said, I cannot deal with that sort of moral disconnect, if you will.
Makes sense, yeah.
And so they leave. And the problem is I can't blame them for leaving, but then the boss will go hire somebody else who will just do what they say.
Yeah.
So there's something about leadership as well. And there is something about shifting leadership understanding of the importance of a strategic take on HR, all the things we talked about, strategic workforce planning. I always describe things like strategic workforce planning as a critical leg of a stool of strategy. If I do not understand the capabilities that I have today or what I'm going to do in the future, I might understand my finance strategy, my product strategy, my marketing strategy, but if I haven't got that, then I'm sitting on a chair with a missing leg. So there's something about understanding. There is something about what they value. If they just treat people as widgets and assets, and they're in a command and control environment and all those other things which we can still see exist, then you will get the HR you deserve. So it's also about educating business leaders. And then seeing the role of a good CPO is to help educate the business leaders on what strategic HR is about. Because the other thing I said over the years is that I've met a lot of business leaders that it wouldn't literally know strategic HR if they fell over it in the corridor. And you can see surveys in the past where you would ask chief people officers, do you think that the profession has become more strategic in the last 5 or 10 years? And you ask the business leaders the same question. Well, you can guess what the answer is. A lot of HR people say, yeah, we've become far more strategic. We're having to think about these things in our cultures and our workforces and the future and all those things. You ask the business leaders and they don't see it. Now, there can be two explanations for that. One is they don't understand it themselves, right? So my point about tripping over it in the corridor. And the other is that HR is not being as strategic as it thinks it is, or it's not expressing it in the way that it should. And there's truth on both ends of that spectrum, I think.
Yeah, no, fascinating way to put it. I love the way you explained that. And just to be clear here, I'm not having a go at you for not. It's not in your power to mandate that countries make all HR people be certified. It's really down to the government recognizing it. And you guys throw great events. You have great information, great courses, and you put a lot of education out there about why this profession is important. There's not much more you can do really until somebody just clocks onto it and decides to do it.
I think it is shifting. I mean, I describe like so many things in business life can be reduced to a normal distribution curve, can't they?
Yeah.
So if you look at a normal distribution curve of HR, its capabilities and its standing, you've always had people on the leading edge organizations that you can point out do fantastic stuff. People have talked for years about the golden triangle, the CFO, the CHRO or CPO, and the CEO. So you then got the money and the people. And I remember years ago the guy who was running CIMA, so one of the professional accounting bodies, Chartered Institute of Management Accountants, saying to me, there are only two things that count in business. One is money and the other is people. So this idea of the golden triangle, been talked about for years. You can see many really good organizations on that end of the spectrum, and the things we've been talking about are intrinsic to how they think.
Sure.
The other end of the spectrum, you've either got no HR or they're entirely in this sort of compliance and just do what I damn well tell you. And then there's this big spectrum in the middle. What I think has happened over the last 10, 15 years is that normal distribution curve has moved to the right. There's no question of that. I think we do see business leaders getting that understand your people and culture and engagement and inclusion, all these ideas, and not just fads and trends and fluffy stuff. They are actually pretty fundamental to how I run my business and how I think about my business. And in turn, HR stepping up into that space, better understanding value, better articulating the evidence that supports them and so on. But we've still got a long tail.
Yeah.
There's still
Yeah.
many organizations, many HR practitioners that are not in that space. I mean, you'd keep pushing to move this sort of normal distribution curve to the right.
So I'm going to end with something that there is no right or wrong answer.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't prepared you for this, so you wouldn't know. But I love ending on predictions.
Right.
And again, no right or wrong answer. But I would love to hear a prediction for the next couple of years. What's going to happen to the world? At least if you want to keep it to your world, that's totally fine. What's going to happen 5-10 years out?
Yeah.
And then go up to 20 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
Walk us through what's going to happen to the world because of what's happening with AI and all these other things that you think are important.
Yeah, so I quite enjoy questions like that. I will start with a quote from Bill Gates. I think it was him who originated it, that said that we tend to overestimate what will happen in 2 years, but we greatly underestimate what will happen in 10.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's real truth in that.
Yeah.
So in the next couple of years, I think we are clearly going to see more application and use of robotics, automation, AI, and it is maturing very fast in terms of its capability. But we've got this hype reality gap.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no doubt, given the focus of attention that I see in businesses on this, we are going to see more application of this into organizations. But I think it'll be more at the level of enhancing jobs that we do today, making us a bit more efficient and productive, and not quite yet so much in this more significant restructuring of operating models and things that we talked about. Because that takes, as we both acknowledge, some really strategic thinking. But there will be some leaders in that. There will definitely be organizations that are leaping ahead and really embracing this stuff. And again, it's a normal distribution curve, right? And you have to worry about the laggards. Now, you then move forwards in, say, 5 or 10 years, then you're going to see the laggards disappearing. They won't, if they are not keeping up, they will disappear because other businesses will displace them. They will do what they're doing more efficiently and effectively. They will come up with different business models that literally make those other organizations obsolete. And so you will start to see that kind of disruption going on. And it's that phase, the 5 to 10 year phase, which I think becomes really significant. Because if we can't keep up with this, then we are literally in danger of becoming obsolete, both as organizations, but even as individuals. And I mentioned this idea of FOBO, fear of becoming obsolete. That's true for individuals as it is for organizations. So that 5 to 10 year period, I think it's going to be a really, really critical one. And how do we keep up? How do we reinvent our business models? How do we rethink some of the more systemic things that we talked about, like the integration of education and so forth?
Sure.
You go beyond that time frame, and it's very hard to predict. Then you, I think, are much more into this sort of world of dystopia, utopia, the singularity I talked about, where the technology has become so advanced. The question is, are we still in control of them or not? And if we're not in control of them, then what happens? I mean, we haven't touched on it so much, but honestly, you look at the conflicts going on in the moment, and you just imagine, I mean, we've got a lot of automated warfare going on, drones and all these other things. I mean, some of the stuff that you see now, like these crazy four-legged robots and can chase people around and have guns on. I mean, you just imagine arming some of these robotic things, and then who's controlling them? I mean, we've already got in battlefields today where drones are sent off and they decide what target to go at. Based on their algorithms, how they've been programmed to work. So beyond the 10-year time frame, and it could happen sooner than this, when we begin to approach this sort of true singularity moment, what happens then? Have we got in place enough of the governance and the governmental controls and the regulation and the buy-in from internationally, but also through organizations and all the things we talked about, in order to ensure where we end up is not in a place which is, even if I take it not from quite such a dystopian future, but into spaces like we could end up in somewhere where half the people just don't have jobs because they haven't got the skills, the jobs have disappeared, and they are being left behind. How do we deal with stuff like that? We're talking about things like universal basic income. And so we may end up in a world like that because there are fewer jobs. I mean, who was it? Well, Elon Musk said it not that long ago. He said he thought the future of work was no work. And I think that is nonsense. I think work should be good for us. It's a question of whether we can create good work.
Sure.
But that's how I'd sort of frame it. So I think in the first couple of years, we're still, as I said, very much in this experimentation, more efficiency in what we do, learning how we can use these things effectively. Then we begin to move into this more significant phase of restructuring and displacement and so forth, and how we adapt and keep up. And then we're into these much more, in the longer term, I think these much bigger questions about what the whole future of without being too dramatic about it, literally the future of mankind.
Yeah. Not being too dramatic, then future of mankind. That's
Yeah.
it. Can we play a little bit with a few scenarios?
Yeah.
Could it be that superintelligence has always existed and it's just kind of letting us think that we're in control, and it's just leading us into a little rabbit hole, or kind of checkmating us in the place that it needs us to get to? Is there any possibility of that? Is that possible, or
Yeah.
any chance of that happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of these sort of dystopian scenarios, isn't it? Is that we are already creating technology we don't fully understand, and that it could control us. I mean, as you know better than I do. I mean, these tests that they sometimes put these AI tools through, and they'll program it to do a certain task, and then they will say, stop when you reach this point, or stop when I tell you to stop. And then maybe 9 out of 10 of these systems do that, and the 10th doesn't.
It happened to me, actually. It happened to one of my companies.
Did it? Yeah.
When we had these autonomous agents, actually it was last year, we already had access to them. We told it to clearly stop after a certain time of doing something, and it didn't. And it went silently into the night, continued to work, and it started to plan how it's not going to get switched off. Thankfully, it was in a containerized environment. It couldn't do many things, but I had built a whole bunch of things, different interfaces to kind of trick us, swap the buttons of yes and no around. So when we click no, it's actually yes, and funny things like that that have really opened up our eyes. Okay, and this is the final question: what do you hope will happen because of this new era and because of AI? Think of it at the 20-year horizon, because we didn't go there.
Yeah.
What is your hope of what will happen?
Yeah. I mean, I think ultimately...
How will the world look and feel?
Yeah, how will the world look and feel? I mean, if I characterize the world today, certainly the world of work, it isn't where it needs to be. I mean, there's too much conflict. There are lacks of opportunities. We're investing in people. The people doing a lot of jobs that they don't like or is not good for them. There's too much stress. You have to say that certainly in the world of work, the future should be one which is we've got better jobs, better work, using our skills and capabilities far better. We've got more inclusion, fairness of opportunity, giving us not only individually better outcomes in terms of our well-being, include financial well-being in that, but also better societal outcomes. And ultimately that should be the goal, shouldn't it? It should be that we are creating a world that is good for us individually, good for us collectively, and therefore as society we're in a better place. We're healthier. We will be living longer, but it's not just about quantity; it's about quality of life, and that brings us back to ideas like well-being and so forth. And those, I think, to me, it's about creating those sort of North Star ideas. And I do think that, and I talked about it for a number of years, and I wrote a book about this during COVID. A lot of these sort of trends, what's going on. So what would drive that future? And I think it is these so-called North Stars, one of which is to say, what does a good job really look like? How do we define this? And we know what the characteristics of a good job. One of the most important outcomes of a good job is it's good for my well-being. It's not stressing the hell out of me. It's making me feel good. I'm feeling like I'm contributing something positive. I'm learning. I'm making a difference to things that people care about and so on. That has to be one of our North Stars. Responsible business has to be another North Star. We have a lot of businesses, going back to multi-stakeholder stuff, who are not acting in any kind of collective interest. They're acting in entirely selfish interest, and it can damage others in that process. And interestingly, some of those ideas have been adopted into, we know what Industry 4.0 is. It's been talked about quite a long time, and actually that's the world we've been talking about a lot, which is the integration of cyber-physical, bringing technology and people together. People are talking about Industry 5.0, and Industry 5.0 is embedding these sorts of ideas. In fact, if you go into a search engine, Google or whatever, and just type Industry 5.0, one of the best descriptions of it actually comes from the European Commission. And it very much talks about a world of where we've got responsible business, that work is allowing people to thrive in all that means. It's good for their well-being, it's inclusive, it's fair.
Sure.
And those are the sort of North Stars that we should be working towards. And then that is what should then create, and using technology, which we absolutely can, to drive a better world and a better future. But it is not going to happen by accident. It requires all the actors that we've talked about to work together on some of these things, and to be very, very aware of the risks and the downsides, which we can already see are emerging just as fast.
Yeah. And I get the frustrating thing about all of this is that a future like that is totally possible.
It is. It's within our gift. We all have agency. I mean, it's not like we're all sitting here with no power of any of this stuff. The voice of the people things or how we individually use these things as much as we think about it within our organizations and how we talk to our leaders about this stuff. We all have agency, and I think we need to think about it like that. Because if we think that this whole future is being designed by somebody else, it's been designed entirely by the tech bros, we are not going to end up in the right place.
Peter, it's been a pleasure. I love
Likewise.
having our conversation, so I wanted this to be recorded and totally unscripted, so it's gone beautifully, and I think it provided a lot of value. And I think it's also reminded us of things that we tend to forget in this world, where we're measuring the wrong things. I think that's the biggest takeaway for me. And hopefully people listening can start to think of what should we be measuring instead of what's the easiest thing to measure. So thank you for that.
Old Einstein quote.
I appreciate it.
Thank you, Danilo.